Hello YouTube! Today I'm doing something a little bit different. You can probably see that I have got some headphones on, and that's because I'm doing my first ever collaboration via distance, and I have Audrey with me.
Hello, yes, I am a Canadian counselor. I work mostly online with people who are abroad. So I speak French and English, and often I work with people who either live in a country where they don't speak their home language. But I don't only work necessarily with people who are living abroad. Sometimes it's just easier for people to see a counselor online. Sometimes just like during your lunch hour, you can pop in into a conference room, have your meeting, and then, go back to work afterwards. So
why were you interested, I would say, in working with people who are in expat situations or living abroad? What fascinates you about that kind of situation?
Well, I think it's a lot about personal experience, actually, because I started being an expat. I started living abroad. At first, I thought that my work I wouldn't be able to export my work. And then I realized that there was a lot of demands for people who are living abroad and living the same challenges that I was going through, and who need help. So I started specializing myself basically in working with expats. I think that sometimes just being abroad and having like homesickness can bring out some other underlying issues that were already there. So let's say if you were already an anxious person, maybe you're going abroad and all of a sudden this anxiety that was on check all of a sudden is really present, and you need someone to deal with that. So it's not necessarily like, oh, I have anxiety about being abroad. It's more like generalized anxiety or feeling depressed as well. So
one of the reasons I started this channel in the first place was to help expats. I really wanted to start this channel to say, hey, you're not alone. I'm going through these kinds of things. So I'm really excited to have you today to talk about the concept of culture shock. What is it? What can it look like? How can it manifest? And of course, what can we do about it? So really, really excited for today's video. How would you define culture shock? What is it exactly?
Well, very broadly defined, I think culture shock is the anxiety, confusion that results from being in contact with another culture. So that's very broad. It's something that immigrants, expats, sometimes we get caught up into like all the nuances of those definitions, but I think that anyone really who is living into another country, or even if you just move, let's say I'm in Canada, if I moved from Montreal to Vancouver, I could live a culture shock, because that could be quite different. It maybe not completely a culture shock, but even for students who are leaving home to go into a more college community and learning and transitioning from home to college, there are a lot of symptoms that are very similar to culture shock, even if they stay within their home country.
It's not necessarily a national culture thing. A culture is the way, it's the norms, it's the beliefs that a particular group of people share. It's the way that they get things done. It's the way that they, see the world. And that can be collective at a national level, but there's also very, very strong regional cultures in France. So if you move from Brittany to Bordeaux, you may have, a shock. And it can happen when you change from one company to another company. Each company has their own culture, so it is pretty broad. For today's video, we'll really focus on that moving to a new country and having that feeling of oh wow, I'm different to these people. So I guess, what I've experienced is that culture shock can come in different levels. So you've got what I would call the surface level culture shocks, which are, language. The classic one in France is the French administration is difficult to deal with, or postal workers are very rude to you, or waiters are rude to you. All these kinds of surface level culture shocks. And then I think you have the deeper level ones, which in France could be something like, fundamentally, I find this group of people quite pessimistic, and I find that quite hard on a day-to-day basis.
From what I've noticed, there seems to be a lot, and I've noticed also in the literature, that there are a lot of phases to culture shock, and it's not like you go through the phases and once you're done, you feel like you're part of this new culture and everything's fine. It's more like you go, you navigate those different stages, and sometimes it can last for a day. You're feeling like, let's say the first phase really of the culture shock, sometimes it's just the honeymoon phase, which is not necessarily something that everyone will go through, especially if it wasn't your decision to live in the new country. I'm thinking of a spouse who is following, husband or wife following, and then you don't necessarily have the honeymoon phase, but then afterwards you have the frustration phase, which is really more like superficial, what you mentioned, like I don't know how to communicate with people, there's this language difference, I don't know where to find things, like more superficial level. And I think like what you're describing is something that is maybe a bit more difficult to deal with, because it's something that you cannot change, so you have to work more on trying to accept and see how you can change your perception and work on yourself to try to navigate those challenges, because those more like superficial level difficulties, like not being able to find a post office, eventually you get adjusted and hopefully you find it. And then once you find it, like you feel like you have a little bit of a comfort zone, like all those things that you didn't understand at first, at some point like you pick up a few words and you're able to feel like you're more fully adjusted. But the things that you're talking about, like the more the deeper like values, perceptions, and all the ways that cultures have influenced your perception at a very deep level, it's something that you will not be able to change, to be able to deal with. It's more of a like personal self-work on how you navigate like the fact that it's like that and you're not going to change it.
It can feel hard sometimes to be the odd one out, because you're around a collective of people that have been brought up a certain way, and they all maybe have a collective belief about something, and you think very differently to that, but you're alone, and that can feel quite isolating. You know that everyone back home, you've got hundreds of thousands of people who think just like you, but in this situation you're the only one fighting for that point of view. Yeah, it can be quite hard, and I've noticed that the journey you're talking about, it's really not linear. So you've got those little superficial culture shocks that everyone kind of notice. As long as they've been in the country for 6 months, they'll probably notice it, kind of thing. But then you adapt to those, and you start having this increased confidence, I feel, and everything's going fine, and you kind of gotten over it. And then it can be like 1, 2, 3 years later that you get this smack in the face, which is sort of like, wow, fundamentally, yeah, as you said, do I accept to live like this? Because it's not going to change.
Yeah, and even that can go in phases. Like some of the time, especially if you've been like, I find that if you're experiencing other difficulties, it can exacerbate this feeling. So if you're like, let's say you've been totally fine with the fact that with your coworkers you view certain things really differently, and then all of a sudden you have a lot of stress at work, or something's happening at home, or even like you've been physically sick for some reason, and then it sort of exacerbates that. All of those things that you were okay with suddenly start to become very very annoying and hard to deal with, and it's like you have maybe this longing to
totally. I've experienced that actually, because if I've ever been experiencing a bit of depression or because I'm really homesick, for example, suddenly everything's agitating me, and it's like, and my French husband was like, I thought you got over that years ago, and it's sort of like, but it's true, it can boil back up to the surface. So what would you say would be just some concrete tips then for people who are maybe experiencing culture shock? Because I see a lot of expats on the forums that I'm part of, some very unhappy people that seem very frustrated with a lot of things that they can't change. So what are some positive things that we could start doing to kind of change our perspective?
I think there's a lot of things. I think one of them, and you've just mentioned it, going on forums and sometimes just finding other people that relate can be very helpful. There's this group that really makes me laugh, which is like Grumpy Expats Abroad, which I thought was hilarious. And it's not, some people take it to another level and they really complain maybe about deeper things, but sometimes it gives a space to complain about more the sort of the minor things that maybe people back home don't necessarily relate to. Like they're thinking, oh, you're having it good, you're living abroad and everything, but sometimes you just need to complain that you wanted to eat Kraft dinner and you can't find it. Those very maybe more superficial level. So I find that connecting with expats can be very helpful. Especially if you can connect with expats that are from your home country, can be very helpful, because they understand really this clash of like having certain values and perspective, and this clash that it's completely different maybe in the country you are in.
I think a lot of expats are ashamed when they're making friends with other expats, especially in France. They're like, oh, I should really make French friends, I know. And I just say to them, there's no need to feel ashamed. If you need to construct your social circle and find really great friends who speak your language, or you connect on whatever other reason, that's fine. You know, there's no shame in that, especially at the beginning. I think people are so harsh on themselves, trying to force themselves to only have native friends when, you know, they will find so many things in common with other expats, and that's cool too.
I think it's important, of course, to integrate yourself in a culture, trying to learn the language, to at least like just the basics, to be able to maybe have like a brief conversation. Just hello, thank you sometimes goes like a very long way. But yeah, I think having both groups can be very important. It always depends which phase you are in as well. But I find like prior to moving somewhere, sometimes just researching, maybe by going on forums, also reading articles, being informed, really helps forging expectations. So that's very helpful. I find that when people are struggling the most is maybe when they were completely oblivious. They were maybe more in the honeymoon phase, didn't research at all, like more the deeper stuff in terms of values and perceptions, and it's like really hitting them in the face very unexpectedly. And also just the fact of feeling like validated, and it normalizes your experience. Sometimes that feels good. You can allow yourself the space to say, oh, I'm not the only one struggling with this. And I think this is what you mentioned with your channel. You wanted to give yourself a space, but also a space for other people to feel like I'm also going through this.
I would also say, you know, looking at things from a gratitude mindset as well, because, you know, there's a lot of frustrations like, oh, I have to learn French as an adult. No, but how about like, oh my gosh, I get to learn a new language and I don't have to suffer through 8 years of high school grammar books. You know, I'm in full immersion, and you know, it's just sort of trying to twist those things that could be negative or scary or frustrating to the positive as well has helped me a lot. So
yeah, that can be very helpful from like doing gratitude lists on a daily basis, especially if you find yourself that you're like, because we have this tendency as humans to really overemphasize the negative. It's like, so from a survival perspective, it makes a lot of sense. Like we're trying to anticipate threat and see what's wrong to try to solve it. But sometimes when we're feeling particularly depressed, it's not really serving us. So trying to force yourself into seeing like you said, like the things maybe that you are grateful for, or the actually positive side of being abroad, can be very helpful as well.
Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this on Culture Shocks. If anyone is watching this and they'd like to connect to you, where can they find you?
They can find me through my website, and otherwise I'm a little bit on Instagram. I have a group on Facebook as well, which is Expat Psych Resources. So if anyone is interested, they can contact me through those websites.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you so much, Audrey, for being with me. And we're actually going to do another video together, guys, so look out for that one. And otherwise, I will see you next time in the next video. A bientôt!
Yeah, bye!